Thanks, Ian. Thanks for that introduction and a bit of a summary of where we're at in terms of programme. So I wanted to share with you some thoughts really around this, what we talk a lot about, the knowing and doing gap. And I'll talk a lot about how we should be thinking like a farmer, think about how we prepare our soil before we move into improvement work. Sometimes we get a little bit busy and we want to launch in without really having any kind of preparation. That's what we want to sort of focus on today. So as Ian said, my name's Nick Holding. I'm an improvement manager with the Emergency Care Improvement Support Team. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Ballsboy. We've also got our ECS Network Twitter account there for anybody who wants it. We've got Erica on the chat room today. She's been keeping on the chat room. So if you want to post any questions as they go, please feel free and we'll pick those up later on. Any comments, more than happy to pick those up. And if we don't get time today, I will definitely come back to you after the session as well. If there's any particular questions or queries that you have or anything you want to raise with me, my email address is connected to this call, so please do drop me a line if you want to chat anymore. So we talked about this knowing and doing gap, and as Ian mentioned there, it's about how we move from what essentially we know often we know what we need to do, but how do we move that into action, as Pfeffer and Sutton talk about in their book, turning knowledge into action. And I think the reason why I've chosen this as the subject for this session is because you just see it so often across the NHS. In the last sort of 20 years, I've been involved in improvement practice. These barriers between we kind of know what we need to do, but just actually breaking through in interaction is often the most difficult bit. And we're recognising we work in complex systems, very, very complex systems. We work, as Richard talked about last time, it's socio-technical. We talk about complex adaptive systems. Recognise it's not easy. If it was easy, we'd have done it by now. It's understanding some of the psychology of change that sits behind some of the barriers and some of the reasons why we don't make those shifts. We're recognising that today, in half an hour, we are only going to scratch the surface, and we could probably do a whole webinar series on psychology of change, and then maybe something for we might just do in the future. So there's a couple of areas I want to focus on in how we understand this bridge between knowing where we need to be but knowing where we want to get to. And there's a couple of things that stand out here in terms of some of the barriers, and we've picked up on one here. Is I'm going to start with incorrect assumptions, and this goes back again to something that Richard was talking about in the last session. Knowing what we need to do often gets in the way as we leap forward into the future, and we find it hard to break through into action. And some of those incorrect assumptions that we find ourselves, as Richard illustrated in the last session, is that we see the world through our own eyes, and we have a little bit of subjective opinion of that, and a little bit of self-serving attributional bias, backed up with a bit of self-confidence bias. We believe that we're right often before we start, but as I often ask, how do you know that you're right if you think you're right? So those incorrect assumptions may be that we believe everybody understands what's expected of them. Maybe we believe that we've communicated the message in a way which is understood by everybody. Sometimes we can have this a perception, how we see the world through our own eyes, where we develop those incorrect assumptions. Again, as we talked about last time, this research by Taleb around naive interventionism, the feeling that we have to do stuff, we have to get on, and we've been asked to do something, so we have to get on and do it, and we find ourselves on the hamster wheel of just finding ourselves in a doing trap all the time. We have to get on and do some stuff, and this relates back to some work and a book written by David Marquet, and he refers to this idea of red and blue work. Red work where it's the doing work, and blue work is our thinking time work. It's all work, but we just separate it out into two different types of work. We find ourselves too often in this, we're on the hamster wheel, and we can't allow ourselves to get off because we need to do the doing. It needs to be done. But there's a balance in giving ourselves that time and that space to prepare, and how we think before we start improvement work, to give us that time to reflect and challenge and plan, and also link up with other people and collaborate. And that's where we need that balance between the blue and the red work. And that goes back to the naive interventionism research that Richard talked about. And this really speaks to this other research that was done first first piece of research was done back in the 80s, but it's been repeated several times since, which demonstrated that 70% of all change efforts fail, achieve no results whatsoever. And that's quite a startling figure when you look at that. This was done across multiple industries, including healthcare. And I think when I look back at my own journey and see the change efforts that I've been involved in, but also seen, this kind of number gets backed up with what we see in practice. But I think more startling than the 70% is that what we also find is that only 25% achieve some of the objectives that have been set out. So we have an idea, we have a plan, we've set off, and now we're looking at 95% of our work doesn't achieve its full objective. Only 5% leads to a sustainable change or improvement. And again, it goes back to, anecdotally, when you think about your own work and your own experience and think about all the efforts that we put in, all the work that we're involved in, how many of those have actually led to a sustainable change and an improvement? And as I often say, this is not about people, it's not about you or as individuals, it's about the processes that you work in. Really good people work in poor processes. And that's what drives these kind of results. And this quote for me, like Goldratt, really kind of sums it up for me. Any improvement is a change, but not every change is improvement. I think we all recognise we've seen it around us enough times to see that we've seen lots of change, but has it always led to an improvement? And you look at some of the research details around that study by McKinsey and others since then, and these are some of the themes that come out of that research. And again, goes back to incorrect assumptions, back to that kind of knowing-doing gap. Looking at unrealistic expectations, are we starting with realistic expectations in the first point? Do we lack buy-in? These are the kind of things that are coming out. Poor communication, the improvement, the idea, where we're trying to get to has not been explained well enough. What's my role in this? What's my role as a leader? What's my role as somebody who's been asked to change? What's my role as somebody who's been asked to contribute to this improvement? But an odd one, and doesn't always land well with everybody, what's in it for me? Sometimes we have to understand what's in it for me to be able to be fully engaged. What's those intrinsic motivations rather than a pure extrinsic motivation, where we often find in change efforts we have those external targets or pressures or action plans or RAG ratings that enforce change or push change on people. But what is it? What's in it for me? What will make me change? Poor utilisation of existing skills is heavy on there, which leads to the time commitment necessary. We assume this is going to take 3 months. Actually, it's probably going to take 6 to 9 months. So are we really clear before we start in understanding what we need to do to get from that where we need to get to where we want to be? Do we understand the realistic time commitment? And that leads on to what's your improvement mechanism? How do you deliver improvement? What is your methodology? What is your style? What is your approach? If it's command and control, top down, delivered through an action plan, it's probably not going to give you the results you need in terms of engaging your teams and understanding what's in it for me and what's my role in that. So when you think about the numbers involved here, as I said, 95% of change efforts don't lead to a sustained change or improvement. Isn't it time we did something different? Isn't it time we looked at, is there a better way of doing this? And there's this quote from that talks about when you discover you're riding a dead horse, the best strategy is to dismount. You don't keep on beating it just until it gets up and moves again. So what I'm offering here, or what I'm asking here, is how we can look at how we've been doing things. Is there a better way? Because as Einstein says, we can't solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. We have to do something different. If we want something different, we have to do something different. If we do the same old, we'll get the same results. So as we think about where we are and where we want to be, thinking about this gap between the knowing and the doing, or where we are now in terms of discharge, or in terms of any kind of project that you're working on, whether it's standard operating procedures, whether it's internal professional standards, criteria of discharge, criteria to reside, whatever you're working on, this is where we currently are, and this is our approach historically to change and improvement. And when we look at the evidence that backs this up, it says that what we've done so far isn't working because we're still in the same situation. So this is where we're playing it safe in the where we are environment. But that's natural. As human beings, we we want to make sense of our world. We resist making mistakes. We don't want to put ourselves at risk. So inherent within us is something that stops us from misunderstanding our world or trying to create chaos in our world by changing what we already do. So we may want to change, we may do our improvement, but we won't fundamentally shift, and that shift does often require this leap of faith into where we want to be. So the second part of this gap, which I think probably for me in the last sort of 20 odd years that within the NHS, the biggest barrier is the fear of failure. I see that so often. This goes back to that fundamental thing that we, as human beings, we don't want to fail. We don't want to be seen as incompetent. We don't want to be criticised. So this fear of failure is such a significant barrier to enable us to move from where we are now to where we want to be. This is very much at the heart of, we know what we need to do, but leaping into that successful shift into the doing, the fear of failure is the biggest thing for me, which gets in the way of that happening, whoever it is. And I've seen this at every level of organisations. As Henry Ford talks about here, failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently. If we learn to embrace failure as opportunity to learn, as not as opportunity to criticise, but recognising that we've tried something, we've given it a go, and we're going to learn from that. And there's a Japanese saying, you fall down 7 times, you get up 8. You keep on going. You develop that enthusiasm to keep going, know where you need to get to, knowing what the end point is, but recognising that there's probably going to be some stumbles along the way, and you're probably going to have to get up a few times and brush yourself down and carry on. So failure is something that, if we want to move forward and move forward in improvement, we have to learn to accept that as part and parcel of what we do. But embrace it, recognise it, learn from it, and use that learning to take us forward. What that gives us is levels of innovation and improvement and ideas and enthusiasm. If all you've got is fear, as Edmund Burke here, the economist and philosopher, talks about, no passion so effectively robs the mind of all its powers and acting and reasoning as fear. It's the single thing that gets in the way of us being innovative and creative and coming up with new ideas, because we're constrained by this idea that we can't get it wrong. We can't get it wrong. We'll be criticised. We'll be ridiculed. We'll be, I don't know, we'll lose face in front of our peers. But this is really sits in at the heart of who we are as human beings. We're conditioned to avoid ridicule. It starts at a really early age. As children, we don't want to make a fool of ourselves in front of our peers. And think about, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but think about those painful teenage years when you just would do anything to avoid any kind of embarrassment or criticism or anything like that. It's hardwired into us. We're conditioned, and when we go into the workplace, it just carries on with us. We just don't want to be shown up or criticised or made fun of by getting things wrong. And that's a hard place to be in if you want to move things forward. That just results in us sticking with the status quo, not doing anything particularly different. And it's some word that Amy Edmondson talks about in her book Teaming, where it's how we approach our improvement work, how we approach our evolution of our current state. Do we organise to learn, or do we organise to execute? And what she's talked about here is that in terms of our planning, are we planning our work willing to learn, willing to be open-minded, willing to have an idea that we got an idea where we need to get to, but we're probably going to be learning as we go? Or do we organise to execute, which is more of a fixed mindset in terms of, I know what the answer is, and this is what we're going to do to deliver it. And it's probably based on a series of steps in an action plan. And I'm not always sure that's entirely accurate. So as we approach our planning and our as we engage with improvement work and we start to think about our improvement work, are we open-minded enough to think that we're going to organise this, knowing that we're going to learn as we go? And similarly, when we move into the execution phase of doing, moving from blue work, as David Marquet talks about, into the red work, into the doing, are we then again willing to start learning as we go, moving into, as we execute our improvement work and test of change, we willing to think that actually we're going to learn as we go, or are we executing for efficiency? Do we have to think that we have to get it right first time, because it'd be a waste of time if we start something and have to change it? The first one, again, is a growth mindset. It's believing that we can learn as we go. We know a certain amount of information now and knowledge. The second one believes, in terms of a fixed mindset, we know all we need to know, and we just need to get on and do it. But failure is at the heart of so many innovations and new technology. And I'm sure you'll all recognise this. This is one of the earliest Dyson vacuum cleaners. This was the major shift into the bagless cyclone technology that James Dyson talks about. But he recognises that it took 5,127 failures to get to the point where he just had a marketable product. But he recognised that when he started, he didn't just give up after the first go and think, oh, it didn't work, let's just go back to what we did before. He was willing to embrace failure. And what that does, it leads to, let's go again. And what else can we do? Excuse me. What else can we do? How further can we develop that idea, and how can it morph and continue to evolve into many different ideas? It's about mindset, and it's about how we as leaders in the improvement world, and how we develop services and products for our patients and our staff. If the mindset is that there's a starting point and an end point, and it's quite linear based on an action plan, then we're probably going to find ourselves not necessarily living in an environment where it's accurate. The reality is that it's often sometimes different. Going back to something that Amy Edmondson talked about, if we organise to learn and execute to learn, the starting point is the same and the end point is the same, but the bit in the middle could be very different. There's going to be full of pitfalls and learning and challenges, but recognising that if we start with a mindset that being open-minded, with a growth mindset, that we're willing to accept those and deal with those as they come. But in the end, we're the people here today, you're the guys here today who've turned up and given your time, given your valuable time to come and listen to this. And one of the points I would want to get across is that the change often starts with us. We're in a position to influence as leaders. Some of our roles are not necessarily always problem solvers, we are problem framers. So change often starts with us. You look back at, if we counted up all the years of experience on this call and all the work that we've been involved in, can we honestly look at ourselves, and I definitely can't say that I've got it right every single time. So it comes back to us as individuals to look at, does change start with us? Because something that Tolstoy says, everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing themselves. So if we start and think about, what's our approach first? What can I change? What's my influence over this first as a leader? And that influence around how can I bridge or narrow the knowing and doing gap? Then we can start to think about how we as leaders can be involved in that change as well, because we all want change. We all say we want change, but we don't necessarily always want to change. And this goes back to another point that Richard talked about, which I'm absolutely fascinated by, is the fact that we operate in a socio-technical system. So we think about things, a lot of our work is, we believe, to be technical, but actually most of it is social. And this work here by Göran Eriksson, he's the Chief Executive Learning and Innovation at Jönköping County in Sweden. He says real change arises through working with the informal processes more than through the formal change management structures. So those change management being the technical systems, action plans, project initiation documents, strategy, those are the technical systems of change, but actually real change arises through those informal social systems. We understand and remember more by interpreting. So don't give me the answer, help me understand what the problem is, so I can interpret that and apply my own thinking to that. As I said before, leaders as problem framers, not problem solvers. Some perspectives we can select, others guide us. So some perspectives will be really obvious and I'll take that off the shelf and I'll use that and I'll run with it. But accepting that for others, some of those perspectives will just guide us. So they'll take part of what we think or part of the idea, but allowing people to interpret that as they feel they need to. It's not giving people a prescriptive, this is what we have to do. We're allowing people to understand where we need to get to, but not being totally prescriptive in how we're going to get there. And that goes down to how we can avoid the narrowing of reality. Again, we talked we talk in those human factors terms about the workers imagined versus workers done. Understanding where the reality of the world that we operate in, understand the reality of the current state, where we need to get to, and what is the gap. But I think for me, and I love this when I first heard it from you, and the last point there is control is an illusion. Accept unpredictability, and this means giving up the need to be right. And as leaders and as people involved in change and in improvement, giving up that need to be right can be very hard. But what we're doing now, we are creating an environment where we're establishing a learning zone through psychological safety, motivation, accountability. And when I say motivation and accountability, I don't mean big stick beating people up with motivation and accountability. I mean in terms of people understanding what's expected of them, knowing where we're heading, what we're trying to achieve around here, mirrored with an environment of a psychologically safe where we accept failure, acknowledge failure, learn from failure, and we don't feel like we're going to be criticised. And that really does place us in that top right learning zone environment that, again, once again, Amy Edmondson talks about that, organising to learn or executing to learn. It avoids that either the comfort zone, the coasting, or that what we often find more often than not is a high anxiety line, high anxiety zone. This is all about developing a new skill, you know, and I'm not, if what I speak to a lot of particularly senior leaders who have got to where they are in life in their positions, often very senior positions, by a particular way of working. They've probably been appointed based on what they've done and what they've achieved and what ideas and solutions they've implemented over the years. What I'm asking is that, you know, that doesn't always lead to a sustainable change. So is there a better way of doing it? But that's not going to happen overnight. Developing your improvement skills only happens through practice. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, it's but a habit. And anything that requires building a habit takes time. Anybody who has learned to play an instrument, I started when I was a teenager and quickly give up. But one of my sons plays the piano, and that's taken years and years and years of practice. It's not something you just pick up. Oh, no, I'm going to start playing the piano tomorrow and just go off and start playing the piano like a professional pianist. Apparently, it takes about 10,000 hours to be proficient at something. So one thing we have to almost accept, this goes back to the sort of narrowing the gap between the reality and the aspirations, is that it takes time to build an improvement habit, both for ourselves and the people that we're working with. So don't think it's going to happen overnight. But a technique you can use which really helps that habit. I mean, these words habits, I'm intentionally building into this because it is about developing a habit that doesn't take a lot of thought after a while because you just do it automatically. It's something that was developed by Mike Rother based on some work at Toyota. And these are some really simple steps that you can take away and think about. Step one is get the direction and the challenge right. Be really clear about where you're heading. Start with the end in mind. Be really clear about what you're trying to achieve. I don't care how far in the future that might be or how ambitious that might be. Just be clear about the direction and the challenge in front of you. Then come back to number two, grasp the current condition, grasp the current state. Where are we now? Need to understand the reality of the gap between where you want to get to and where you are now. Whether that's subject matter around criteria-led discharge or criteria to reside, or develop internal professional standards. Wherever you are right now, understand where you want to get to, but be really clear about where you are. So everybody's starting point is the same. Because a lot of these things, if you ask 10 different people where we are in terms of any of those subjects, there probably be 10 slightly different answers to understand the current state. But then don't start your improvement work thinking that we're going to work from here to the end. Understand where you need to get to next. So establish your next target condition, the third step in the process there. Understand where you need to get to. What's your next best aspiration? So it could be you want to introduce a particular improvement, maybe on one ward or one unit, or with one division, one group, whatever it might be. What's your next target condition? Don't think about how you can change the world overnight. Come back to developing this habit where you know the direction you're heading in, but we need to understand where we want to get to next, and you really do then start to break it down and make it manageable. Or as David Marquet talks about, you chunk it small, but do it all to make it understandable, make it manageable, but knowing that you're going to get to the end point, because you're really clear about where your direction of travel is. And I'm sure you've all come across the model for improvement before. So I'm not going to go into too much detail around this, but this is chunking it up. This sits in the experimentation space. This helps us understand, if we understand our current state and we know where we want to get to, breaking this down into this model is a really helpful way to do that. Be really clear about what's the aim, what are we trying to accomplish here? That could be the overall goal, but more likely it's your next target condition. How will we know that a change is improvement? Go back to Eli Goldbach quote again, every change, all improvement requires change, but not all change is an improvement. The amount of times it just drives me at the wall. The amount of improvement I see, or change efforts I see, that don't have any metrics attached to it. Well, how will you know? How will you know that an improvement has happened? How will you know that you're on the right track? So measurement is always really, really important. And then what are your ideas? That freedom to try things out, that release of that fear of failure. What are the ideas that are going to help us drive towards that improvement, where we want to get to, how are we going to get there, and how we're going to try that? Then use those rapid improvement cycles of plan, do, study, act. And we use plan, do, study, act so often, I think it's even got its own terminology. We'll PDSA something. I mean, what is that anyway? But we talk about PDSAs as if they're so common. But what we're not doing is we're not seeing it through properly. What we're really good at, and what I see a lot in the NHS, is there's lots of plans. We are great. We are world beaters at creating plans. Strategy, action plans, project initiation, all those, we are brilliant at sitting in meeting rooms and developing plans for stuff. Sometimes we actually get on and start to do some stuff. We launch from blue work, the thinking time, into the red work, and we'll start to do some stuff. But what we're not great at is the study bit. How do we understand and learn what has happened previously within the planning and the doing? This goes back to not just measurement, but just getting some sense of, is it heading in the right direction? And then how do we act on that? And this second half, the study and the act bit, is essentially the bit that the gap between how we get something going and actually move towards a sustainable change is because we're not always necessarily in that space where we're learning. We almost get to doing and think, right, we've done that, let's move on to the next thing. And it's what sits at the heart of that is leadership. What sits at the heart of the plan, do, study, act cycle is leadership. The leadership's role in this, leadership is not about delegating this down to people who are doing the work at the front line. They're definitely involved, but leadership has a role in bringing it all together through support, evaluation, through the improvement process, and also the planning. So we as leaders in the organisations sit at the heart of this, and we have a fundamental role to play in terms of those tests of change and ensuring that they are continuing, but we also learn and monitor and track and reflect and give people the time to input and contribute to those future improvements. So I guess it comes down to, as we come towards the end of this session, we have choices. We can continue doing the same old and expecting different results, or we can just hope that something magical happens and we get the improvements that we want. But we've been talking about a lot of these things, these challenges now for quite some time. It's the same things coming up over and over again. So we have to look and say, is there a better way of doing things, and acknowledge that sometimes it is there are better ways out there, but we're all just a little bit too busy to start to think about how can we do things, and that requires us to stop for a moment. I want to end with a little story. Here comes Edward Bear now down the stairs behind Christopher Robin. Bump, bump, bump on the back of his head. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs. He's sure there must be a better way. If only he could stop bumping a moment for us to think about it. Sound familiar? So a few session takeaways from me, just to leave you with a few thoughts. Bridging the knowing gap starts with prep. understanding how we can prepare our soil before we launch into it, thinking like a farmer or a gardener. If any gardeners out there, you don't go off to the garden centre and spend a fortune on new plants and then just stick them in some barren soil at the back of the garden. How do we prepare the soil before we start? Change does start with me, change starts with us. We have to look at how we approach this. Embracing failure as an opportunity to learn. Keep that in your head. Fall down 7 times, get up 8. That opportunity to keep on going with no loss of enthusiasm. And then begin with the end in mind. Focus on the journey. Know where you need to head to, but then breaking down how we're going to get there into manageable chunks. Chunk it small, but do it all. Always like to share a few references from the books that I've robbed all this information from. First one from David Marquet, written 2 great books. Leadership is Language is brilliant, taking some of the content from today from that book. His other book, Turn the Ship Around, is such a great example of leadership and leadership in action. In terms of psychological safety and teaming by Amy Edmondson. And if anybody who's really interested in organizational psychology and culture and leadership, then The Foreword by Edgar Schein, his book, Organizational Culture and Leadership, is a fantastic book as well, if that's your thing. And then finally, Mike Rother's Toyota Kata, talk about the habits that we develop within our people and our improvement exercises, so it becomes automatic, as we do when we get in a car, turn the key, seatbelt on, we drive up. It becomes such a learned behaviour. That's it for me. Thank you very much for listening. Any comments, observations, any questions, please put them in the chat. Anything after the session, more than happy to pick those up